the second of the three Army Men games to appear on the Game Boy Advance, Operation Green takes a step back from having Sergeant Hawk be a protagonist, and that makes it a departure from the more recent Army Men games, and it takes the series back to its roots with a run-of-the-mill looking green soldier as your protagonist. Whereas Army Men Advance was a rather awkward and very out-of-place feeling entry, Operation Green remedies that by returning to the look and the feel of the earlier Army Men games. While some may say that's not exactly a good thing, it was a return to form that I personally was thrilled to see. After the downright bizarre visual style of Army Men Advance, it's a breath of fresh air to see Operation Green feature the series' standard subpar visuals. Normally I would say something like that sarcastically, but in this case, I mean that in complete seriousness. The Army Men series has never been especially impressive with its visuals, but I have grown a bit attached to them, and Operation Green's look fits in with the norm. In a lot of ways, this feels like the first Army Men game on Game Boy Advance, just because of how out of place Army Men Advance felt. This is a much more natural progression from Army Men 2 on the Game Boy Color, with both design and gameplay, than Army Men Advance was. The sound design, for the most part, is the same painfully okay quality as the rest of the handheld games in the series. But the music is delightfully and surprisingly not the same three measures looped endlessly. It's not particularly good, but it's far less maddening than what we had in Army Men or Army Men 2. And unlike in Army Men Advance, background music actually exists here. The game's mechanics and overall level design, however, are what really stand out. This is hands down the best of the Army Men handheld games. I enjoyed Army Men 2 a decent bit, but I legitimately had a good time with most of Army Men Operation Green, rather than just having a good time in comparison to the torture that the rest of the series was. It genuinely could stand on its own as a decent, even if mediocre, third-person shooter for the system. The game's story, on the other hand, is, unfortunately, pretty bland even for an Army Men game, and it has a lot in common with Army Men Air Combat for Game Boy Color with regards to the plot. Each mission, for the most part, is its own separate thing, and while various missions may tie together as being part of different operations, they all feel pretty isolated and disjointed. The game's other flaw is some of the technical details of the level design. Overall, the levels and environments feel varied and interesting enough, but about halfway through the game, the levels start to get really long. The last quarter of the game has levels that are genuine labyrinths in design. In general, this might not be too bad, but when a game over sends you back to the start of a level that could have potentially taken you 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how quick you were to find your way across, it gets very frustrating. Thankfully, the game is pretty generous with health pickups. Not that that really helps once you start encountering enemies equipped with flamethrowers, but the previous game's general approach of 30 short levels rather than 12 long levels does fit the game and the style of the series better, in my opinion. Army Men Operation Green is, without a doubt, the best of the handheld Army Men games. While that might not necessarily say a ton, it is a legitimately enjoyable game, even if not a particularly standout game compared to some of the other offerings on the Game Boy Advance. The levels are a little bit too long for my taste, and the story is garbage, but the gameplay itself is fun, and the level variety and the environments make for some really interesting battle settings, and honestly that's the most important thing. For collectors of the Game Boy Advance, this is definitely a worthwhile game to give a shot. If you're a casual fan of 2D third-person shooters, it's worth a go, but if you don't fall into that category or the category of avid Army Men fan, for whom this game is an absolute must-play, this is really not anything special. And that's pretty standard for Army Men games. A lot of fun for fans of the series, a decent collection piece for collectors for the system, but for the average gamer, there's just not a lot to offer. My rating for Army Men Operation Green on the Game Boy Advance is a C.